Hey there, welcome to this story about a goblin who sells potions. This story was inspired by a song which is featured in a horror movie, and I encourage you to listen to it while you read this. There are three important parts to this story. The beginning, where we meet our characters and get introduced to the plot. The middle, which takes place in the forest, and the end after they've come back home. And each part has its own unique style and tone. So in order to make sure that the reader knows how to interpret the story, I put together a set of guidelines for myself, which I will talk about right now. For the beginning, I wanted to establish the fantasy setting and introduce the main characters as well as the goblin. Since this is the part where we meet the characters, I made the language more formal because I didn't know them yet, and I wanted to keep a bit of distance. This also allowed me to describe the setting in more detail. For example, here, instead of saying the shop looked like a rundown shack, I wrote, "The bell over the crooked wooden door let out a discordant chime." You can see that I also paid attention to small details, like the fact that the door was crooked, the cap the goblin was wearing was battered, and that he had sharp eyes. All of these things are clues to the reader, foreshadowing things that are going to happen later in the story. Also, I chose a third-person omniscient point of view because I wanted to be able to describe the thoughts of both characters. I also used a lot of sensory detail. For example, when describing the apothecary, I didn't just write, "The walls were lined with shelves," but I expanded on it by adding, "The scent of dried herbs and acrid potions hit them like a wall, earthy, metallic, and oddly sweet." I did this so that the reader could feel like they were really present in the scene. Now, the middle of the story is where the forest comes in. And here I made the language less formal and more casual because the characters are more relaxed. The description of the forest and the creatures they encounter is also more vague and symbolic. For example, here instead of saying the forest was creepy, I described the trees as impossibly tall and black and slick like obsidian. The dripping sap becomes a pool of black water, and the crystal heart glows faintly red. This way, I didn't tell the reader directly that the forest is dangerous, but I show them instead. I also started to focus less on what the character says and more on what they do and think. For example, when they reached the clearing, I wrote, "On the second night, they saw the first of the shadows. It slithered between trees faster than a blink. A shape with too many limbs and no face." Instead of saying the girl were scared and then describing their actions, I just showed their reactions. The reader can see that they are afraid by the things they choose to say and do. For example, she remembered the goblin's words, "The violet if you're scared." Heart pounding, she drank the violet vial. Showing the character like this forces the reader to empathize with them because they are experiencing the story along with them. And since most people are familiar with the concept of fear, it's easier to understand and relate to. This way I tried to make the story as immersive and engaging as possible. And finally, for the last part, I chose to go back to the more formal style of writing because the story is coming to an end and the characters have developed and changed. For example, when they come home, the shop's gone and the story ends with a fairy tale-like tone. Now, the reader feels like they know the characters and can see the story from an outside perspective. All in all, I tried to match the style to the voice of the narrator. That way, the story unfolds in a natural way and it becomes easier for the reader to follow and understand. Of course, these are just my personal choices, and there are many ways to tell the same story. The important thing is to stay consistent throughout the whole piece. If you like this story, I invite you to check out more stories and leave a like. If you want to support the channel, you can check out the memberships or click the link below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.